Okey-dokey. Okay, folks, you're very welcome. Lunchtime lecture, as you see, food for the body, food for the mind, food for the soul. We have it all today. Cathy's going to cover certainly the mind and the soul, I think, in her talk. As you all know, Cathy's work, it brings a new dimension to the kind of stuff that we do, and it's very integrative and multidisciplinary. So I think without further ado, I'd let her go off and integrate and multidisciplinary. Off you go.
Thank you so much. This is, I gave this to a medieval seminar, a practice run on a medieval seminar in Galway on Friday. So there's actually quite a lot of slides, but there are ones with pictures, and I know I have 5 substantial points. So I may zip past slides to get to the ones with pictures and the substantial points on the page, but we can go back and revisit. The reason Anamcara as a topic seems to be relevant to an Irish Studies lecture series is that as a result, I think, of John O'Donoghue's work, Anamcara is a phrase which you find all over the net, used in a whole variety of institutions, mainly to do with healing. John O'Donoghue's book is really very much about friendship. The literal translation of Anamcara, as you probably know, is soul friend. And he talks about the Anamcara experience opening a friendship that is not wounded or limited by separation or distance. And such friendship can remain alive even when the friends live far away. Okay? And it's been used, as I say, in institutes from California to Melbourne to Inverness, as well as Irish ones. The middle one there is an Irish website for bereaved parents. But key to this lecture is a statement he makes on page 19, where he says, rather than being a piecemeal analysis of Celtic data, this attempts a somewhat broader reflection, an inner conversation with the Celtic imagination. Well, I work on the piecemeal analysis of Celtic data, so what John O'Donoghue says is not particularly relevant to what I'm going to be doing. But that's the context in which it seemed to me to be relevant to an Irish Studies seminar. And I start with a poem which is incorporated into the book, a 12th century book of Leinster, and there's an introduction to the poem in prose, which says that Daniel, grandson of Deirdre, Arcinach of Lismore, was entreated by a woman. He was her Anamcara, and she was petitioning him. And then the poem continues. Now, whether the prose introduction is the same period as the poem, that's a bit of a debate. As you can see, the author has been identified with this guy who dies in 863. And the point of the poem is that having gone through the experience of confession, this woman kind of loses the run of herself, and the Anamcara, Daniel, is forced to say, you know, thus far and no further. Yeah? And then the prose introduction finishes by saying, well, there's truth here, you're right on that, she says, and she bends before his perpetual purity as long as she was alive. And probably because of the prose top and tail to this poem, the word Anamcara here is translated as confessor. And Gerard Murphy's translation is what you get in the dictionary definition of Anamcara. But there are a couple of problems. Okay? The poem is really about an attempt at seduction by the woman, but the top and tail prose and introduction does put it in the context of lay confession. Yeah? And it also puts it into the context, if you see that, his perpetual purity, it also puts it into the context of celibacy of the clergy. And when you start looking at that context, both of those contexts seem as if they could at least possibly be later than the period attributed to the author of the poem. So, for example, celibacy of the clergy is admired right throughout our documentation for the early Irish Church, but it only really becomes an issue in the period of the 11th and 12th century reforms, after the Gregorian reforms in the Church. And between 901 and 1161, for example, there's only 6 people who are identified in their obits as celibate. And similarly, bishops who die in 1164, Bishop Duncan O'Brien, for example, he, in the genealogies, if you look at it, he gives rise to the MacEscots, the sons of the bishop, the family known as the Clan Escop, and then Bishop Constantine, whose name is from Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, but he gives rise to a family that's still very prominent in Clare, the Constantines. Yeah? And again in 1194. And there's a letter from Muirsho Éine to the Pope in 1199 where he's writing to the papacy asking for advice about ordaining the children of married clergy. And the reply of the Pope was, if they're born of legitimate family and if they're of moral upright character, that's absolutely fine. And it's hardly surprising that, because his predecessor as Pope, Pope Adrian, came from a family, just such a family, so he was hardly in a position to say anything else. So celibacy of the clergy, although it strikes the modern ear as absolutely normal, was not necessarily normal in the 9th century when our Daniel was supposed to have been writing. Similarly, if you look at the history of the sacrament of confession, it's quite difficult to find information about it, partly because it is obviously a secret process. And this article by Alexander Murray, he talks about the difficulties of searching out evidence for confession. And he says there's 4 peculiarities about confession. It's individual, and it involves the priest improvising words for one person as opposed for a general audience. So it's difficult to write a textbook or guidelines in anything other than general terms. It's instant, it's secret, and it's unscripted. Yeah? And Robert Means, there's been a book, there's a conference in York that these articles come out of, which was published under the title Handling Sin. And Robert Means has suggested that, in fact, although we have a whole discussion about confession and whether or not it was around from the 6th century or whether it actually only started in the 13th century, the tenor of his remarks, and Sarah Hamilton and various other people, is that a lot of that discussion is denominational in nature, and it's about the fights between Catholics and Protestants today as opposed to the medieval evidence. And he says that when you get medieval Carolingian evidence, the evidence is that confession is being discussed mainly in law books for bishops and in school books, but not, in fact, in manuscripts which seem to be intended for the use of a priest in a local pastoral ministerial context. Okay, so my first point is that, checking the time, is that when we translate anam cara as confessor, we may be using phraseology which was very common in the 19th century when people started translating Old Irish, but is not necessarily as common in the early medieval church. Or at least we need to think about it in a bit more detail than we have. The first reference that we have to anam cara, the actual word itself is a compound of early type, but the first instance that we have of it turns up in the Würzburg glosses, which is a series of glosses in Old Irish on the letters of St. Paul. And it turns up on 2 references in 1 Corinthians 9 and then another one in the letter to the Ephesians. And the interesting thing is that in each of these cases, it's associated with the word teacher. Okay? And it's in this one where it says, am I free, am I not an apostle? Am I not free, am I not an apostle? And the Irish glossator goes, since I am an apostle and I am a teacher to everyone, should I not be free? And then later on it says, my soul friend, my anam cara is good. One of the interesting things about these quotes is the extent to which the teacher element in Irish overlaps with the preaching. Okay? And that is also true in the letters of St. Paul, particularly in Ephesians, we get this overlap between teachers and preachers. Yeah? And in fact, In the gloss on Ephesians, in Würzburg glosses, the Irish writer has seen the Latin word doctores, the doctors of the church, and translates it as anam charaja, or soul friends. So, what does the early Irish church think of as doctors of the church? Well, there is in fact a whole set, there's a magnificent source called the Collectio Canonum Hibernensis, which is a collection of florilegia, quotes from authorities of the church, which is put together around the 730s. And there's 64 books on all sorts of interesting topics, but one of the books is on doctors of the church. And in that book there's 19 separate chapters, and the authorities quoted are St. Jerome in detail, Pope Gregory the Great, Isidore of Seville, various Gallic canons, Gregorius Nazianzenus and Augustine, and also the Old and New Testament, and indeed our old friend St. Paul. And again you see here another quote here where we have through preaching, and this is actually a reference to a sermon, as we'll see from Pope Gregory, but here the word precept there, just like the word English word precept, is actually based on the verb to preach, but it was interpreted by Stokes and Strachan as teaching in this instance. Okay. I just put this in because we teach in a place that teaches teaching, as it were, and there's a particularly nice quote again from Würzburg where it says, it provides a gloss which is discussing the nature of teaching, and it says, it's a custom of good teachers to praise the understanding of their listeners so that they may love what they hear. It's nice to know that the principles of education in Ireland haven't changed much in the intervening 1500 years. Okay, so the book on doctors of the church opens with a quote from Pope Gregory the Great, and it's about this issue of pay. And it says, we should be paid on the earthly life, but really our pay comes at the end of our life when we get to heaven. And this is one of his gospel homilies. And the bit I have underlined there is actually, this is quite typical in the Collectio. They quote from the universal source, the church, Pope Gregory in this instance, but then they put in a little bit at the end which is specific to Ireland, and which is the Irish comment or grounding the general precept in an Irish context. Okay? And the bit that's underlined is really relating to the nature of Irish society, that everybody is entitled to be paid their wages. A client of a lord is entitled to be paid his wages, as is a farmer, as is a shepherd. Okay, another source that's used in this text is Isidore and his Sententiae, and it's about the problem of what happens when you have somebody who teaches well and who knows the ideas, but in their own lifestyle doesn't actually implement the ideas. And Isidore says, he who teaches well and lives badly, it's as if he is a candle to others. I like this image. He showcases the light, but he himself is burnt and extinguished. And what's nice about that quote is that actually when you go through the references to early Irish churchmen, churchmen in particular rather than churchwomen, but there are an awful lot of references to them as involved with the imagery of light, and quite a few of them are called candles. Yeah? And St. Senan of Scattery, for example, is identified in Bethaphoric as the candle of the household of God. And he's also identified, which is interesting in this context, as Ceannath Comhairc, or the head of council. So he's both an advisor and an illuminator. So my second point is that the doctors of the church are seen as teachers and preachers, and the overlapping concepts involved in that. And the specific thing I'm mentioning is that the Irish are citing diocesan clerical sources for this. Okay? They do quote St. Jerome as well. But it's interesting because we tend to think of the Anam Cara as a monastic institution and a monastic background to it. But here, very definitely, the word is being used in association with the teaching to the wider lay society. Okay. And I go back to Rob Beans and the notion that there's a very long-standing tradition that the Irish Church is entirely monastic in its origins. And this has been under some discussion by the few of us who work on this since the days of Monsignor Corish in 1972, but it's still an embedded idea. And here we have Rob Means in 2013 saying the same, that the confession originated in the monastic practice of devotional confession in an Irish context. No, so what is that monastic context? Well, if you look back to the Desert Fathers, you have some fantastic quotes about, as a union rep, I really like this story. Some brothers live with me. Do you want me to be in charge of them? He says to the Abba. And the Abba says, no. If they want to live like you, they'll just imitate you. And the brother said, but they want me to be in charge. And the old man said to him, no, you have to be their example, but not their legislator. And again, there's other, the sayings of the Desert Fathers, there's fantastic stuff in that. But that's the idea of the original ideas we have it in our sources. In the Regula of St. Basil of Cappadocia, an Eastern, Cappadocia is in Turkey, it's an Eastern authority, but actually it is something which is cited quite a lot in the Irish Church, St. Basil's rule. And it says, should someone who wishes to confess his sins confess them publicly to everybody, in the manner of public confession, and in the manner that is called for in the New Testament, or should they go to a single individual and simply confess them to them? And St. Basil says, no, go to one person really, the person who is entrusted with the stewardship of the mysteries of God. Okay? And he draws a parallel with people who would confess their sins to John the Baptist and to individuals in the Acts. Okay? One of the problems for Irish scholars is Anam Cara is an old compound, but the actual phrase, the phrase soul friend, we don't think was created in Ireland. We think it was created on the basis of an analogous form in some other language, but we don't know where the phrase is. You know, we haven't got an example anywhere else. But the key monastic authority that everybody cites in relation to monastic influence on Irish practice is John Cassian, and in particular his institutes. Okay? And he says that he has a number of 3 major texts, the Institutes, the Conferences, and the Rule on Prayer. But he talks about, the Institutes in particular are about a series of spiritual exercises so that you grow you learn to be more devout, essentially, in your monastic role. And he starts off and he's talking about the robes and the dress of people, and then he talks about praying at night, which you do much more often than you do during the day. And then he talks about the 8 vices, starting with gluttony and going on to covetousness and lust and anger and dejection and all the rest of it. Okay? What's interesting about that is that he's very keen, or one of the things that's interesting is he's very keen to identify the whole notion of identifying these vices so that the church or the church leaders can act as spiritual physicians and doctors who will help you cure these vices. And the principle, he says, is that contraries are cured by contraries. But he uses the image of doctors, medical doctors, a lot. And that's interesting because when you come to look at the Irish penitentials too use the imagery of doctors, medical doctors. And so the penitential of Cummian starts off and says, we're about to tell the remedies of wounds according to the rules of the fathers. Okay, and let us look at the medicine of Holy Scripture. And in fact, when you go through Cummian's penitential, there is 12 medicines, as it were. 8 of them are clearly drawn from Cassian. Okay, and he actually says on the principle of contraries cure contraries, baptism will cure gluttony, charity will cure fornication, almsgiving will cure avarice, etc., etc. And then he adds in another 4, which aren't in Cassian. And I find that absolutely fascinating because in our medical texts, in vernacular law, there is a statement that the doctors of Ireland use the 12 doors of the soul as part of their medical training. And when you ask people who study medieval medicine, where's this idea of the 12 doors of the soul, they don't know. And Vinci, in publishing this text, he didn't know either. So I'm wondering, is the notion of the 12 doors of the soul actually coming from Cumian, which in turn is coming from Cassian? So you have a metaphor in a monastic text being transferred eventually to a text on law and how medicine works in early Ireland, which I find interesting. But the concept of Anamclara is as a monastic role, is found in narrative sources from Ireland, and I just give this example from the Book of Leinster. It's a young churchman of the Weenshire of Ferns, and he's a Dalta, he's a fosterling or a pupil of St. Bridget, and St. Bridget says, do you have an Anamcar? And he says, yes indeed, and she says, very good. A man without an Anamcara is a body without a head, or the water of a lake which is limey. It's neither good for drinking nor for washing. We've quite limey water in Limerick, don't we? And that is life of somebody without an Anamcara. So my third point is that there is clearly the monastic ideal of elders giving advice and support and leadership to younger monastics is something which seems to play a role in the definition of an Irish Anamcara. But when we go back to Cumian's penitential, and I'm going to go fly through this because there's a lot of information in this section, but it's probably overdone. It doesn't shadow Cassian in detail. When you read Cassian's work, the Institutes, line by line, you then read Cumian's penitential, what you get is that Cassian is dealing with spiritual growth and with mental strengths and with thinking out ways of dealing with vices. Cumian is a lawyer, and he deals simply with penalties. Okay, so gluttony, for example, Cassian is saying things like, well, it's part of self-discipline, and it involves ceaseless prayer, and be careful how you judge others, and the eyes and the heart, and so forth. Cumian talks about being drunk, yeah? and how you shouldn't, provisions about drinking too much, provisions about eating too much, and so forth. Very, very different on fornication, and I mention that partly because that's the one that people talking about Irish penitentials outside Ireland have all tended to focus in on, that they're really obsessed about sex over there. This tariffed penalty business, why are they so, why do they go to such detail on it? And actually it makes perfect sense if you think of Cumian as a lawyer, because what he's doing is he's taking the principles of Brehon law, which is first of all that in every crime you have a certain element of the fine to redeem the crime, which is related to your status or your log nainach, your price of face. So he lists off all the different grades, and then you have an element of the crime or the fine which is paid for in relation to the crime itself. So then you list off all the crimes. So that's what Cumian is doing. It's not about sort of wallowing in all the possible things that people could get up to. It's much more simply a case of, first it's the grades involved, and then it's the crimes. And if you read Brehon law, that's the way all Brehon law texts are organised. And it's quite interesting to go through the penitentials and look at the way in which there are quite clearly different systems of punishment for the same crime, but for different groups of society. And so for a churchman, for example, a lot of crimes are sorted out by sending them into exile, whereas the laymen have to pay fines, and the women are kind of abandoned on the hillside and left to God. Okay, so I'm going to skip through that, but if you can go through all the books in Cumian's penitential and compare the two, and it's a very interesting exercise. But the key one for Cassian is superbia, or pride, and he says everything is about building up to that and dealing with that. And there's a very interesting book that's just come out, published by Columba Press, on the Irish Round Towers, and it's a suggestion that the Irish Round Towers is another area where people are taking the concepts of Cassian and reinterpreting them in an Irish context. So Cumian reinterpreted Cassian to produce evidence for law and ideas about law, And this author is suggesting that maybe the round towers are building on Cassian's idea, and I quote it, it's an image he uses a lot, but that you have to build strong foundations, and then gradually, if you have strong foundations about humility, then you can build up to the sky, and you can build the contemplation of God. And that maybe that's the theoretical concept behind the uniquely Irish phenomenon of the round towers. It's an interesting idea. Who makes the decisions in Cumian's penitential? At the end of your period of penance, and the nature of penance is described in the Flexio, somebody has to make a judgment the penance is now completed, and that is done according to Cumian by a priest. But if you look at the Old Irish Penitential, which is a translation of Cumian's Penitential and building on it, but through Old Irish, Cumian is writing in Latin, instead of the word priest, what we get is the word anamcara. Okay? And an anamcara provides decisions on gluttony, on avarice, on anger, the same quotes as we're getting in Cumian. And that fits in to other material that we have in a variety of other texts, which says that the anamcara is very important in the judgment of penitence in particular. And he is the one who is the intercessor between penitents and the wider community. Okay? And Colman Etchingham, in his book Church Organisation, he looks at the group of people who are called penitents and he says, okay, are they society in general, or are they just the people who live on monastic and church lands? Yeah? And he has this very strong notion that essentially most people in Ireland were not, in fact, although Ireland was a Christian country, he says most people in early medieval Ireland were not in fact practicing. And practicing Christianity was really limited to the tenants of church lands. And he sees penitential people as being in that category, belonging to the category of people who are called manic, which is a word which comes from the Latin monachus, meaning a monk, but which is extended in Ireland to mean tenantry. I have a problem with his model. He doesn't really have a position in the model for believers. And he seems to feel that penitence, you're only penitent if you're sort of offering up your penance in one hand and a roast pig in the other, as a donation to your landlord. And I think he has too narrow a view myself, but that's his model. I wouldn't really recommend reading it in the book, because the book is quite detailed and goes around in circles a wee bit. There's an article in Luxury and Austerity, which is a much better synopsis of his thinking on this. Okay, but it does raise a point which people have been very curious about the early Irish penitentials, which is why is it that some of the tariffing, some of the sins involved seem to be the sins of church people, and some of the sins appear to be done by lay people. And that has normally been understood by the people who've looked at this as, well, here you have one text, and here you have another text, and here is poor old coming in and shoving them together and not really knowing what he's doing. If, on the other hand, you think of it as a practical guidebook or textbook, it seems to me that what we're dealing with is penance as relevant to a mixed community of both church people and lay people. And church people who are not just diocesan or monastic, but both. Okay? And the model I have for understanding that, and this is in tune with a lot of work which is going on in different countries at the moment on the early medieval church, is this encounter that I had when I did a walk from Canterbury to the Italian border. And when you come, this is the Abbey of Saint Maurice is here. This is Lac Léman. Here's Geneva over here. And you're walking up to the pass, the Grand Saint Bernard. But Saint Maurice is a monastery that was set up in 515 by the King of Burgundy. But while you go through it, while you walk up the valley to the pass, you're passing a set of parish churches which is manned by the people who live in the monastery. And in fact, the hospice at the top of the pass is also manned by people belonging to the monastery, and they do a rotation. And this is a very rare system nowadays of an organisation where it is in fact, in this case, canons who are offering living in community but who have jurisdiction over a parish setup. And there aren't that many people do this walk, and I was doing it on my own. So the abbot called me in, and we had, we had a conversation, and he told me this story about his predecessor. He was very proud of this story. His predecessor had been called to Rome, and Pope John Paul had said to him, really, this is a ridiculous system. I know you've been there a long time and everything, but there's the Diocese of Sion, and we really need to put your parish churches in under the Diocese of Sion. And the abbot said, but we've been in charge of this valley since 515, and, we do a good job. And the Pope apparently said to him, at least this was the story, that yes, but you're very small, and really this is a historical anachronism. And the abbot apparently replied, you mean small like the Vatican City is small, Holy Father? And they're still there. As I say, he wasn't telling the story of himself, but of his predecessor, but he was very proud of it. But what I'm suggesting here is that maybe Cummion's penitential is relating to a similar type of setup where you have a community of people who are involved in pastoral instruction and ministry, but who are also involved in monastic life. And although one tends, in the interests of clear thinking, to separate those two strands, in practice, we know that, in fact, that the two strands are often muddled, and they've been muddled since the days of Augustine, when Augustine, as Bishop of Hippo, lived with a community of monks, and is still muddled, if you like, the Redemptorists down the road, which are a community of monks who offer pastoral care. So the distinction is often muddled, and I'm suggesting that's what that muddle is what's being reflected in Cummion's penitential and other Irish penitentials. And it's interesting, if you look at Gilla of Limerick, who was the first guy in an Irish context to write, he's Bishop of Limerick, and he writes a manual for parish priests, among other things. And he says, well, this is what the parish priest's duties are: to teach, to instruct the baptized, etc., etc. But you'll notice if you read through that, she says, galloping along at a pace, that actually what he's using is Cassian's monastic 8 vices. Okay? And so there you have a situation where Gilla again is taking the elements of Cassian and reinterpreting them in a new concept. The background to Gilla's writings on pastoral care have caused a lot of confusion to people working on the universal church, because they say, where are these ideas coming from? He seems to be on the one hand very modern and on the one hand very old-fashioned. But it seems to me that, coming from the view of the Anamkara, one of the things he's doing is he's interpreting the priest in the light of the preceding role as Anamkara. Okay, and then finally, I want to look very briefly at a concept which plays a big role, for example, in Hugh Connolly's book on penitentials. And in the introductory section of that, he says, maybe the Anamkara is somebody who comes from Celtic Druidry. And it's the old role of a druid being reinterpreted in a church context. Now that idea is coming from Forrest Gassa Geoffrey Keating, writing in the 17th century. And Geoffrey Keating gives a discussion of Queen Cormac MacArt, an ancient king of Ireland, remembered as the quintessential just king. And in Keating it says that every High King of Ireland should have 10 officers. He should have a floth, a brehiv, a brehon, a druid, a physician, a bard, a shanachie, a musician, and then 3 stewards to feed the household. And then at the bottom of it he says, and that's true, Cormac MacArt was supposed to have lived around the time of Christ, And he says, after the faith arrived with St. Patrick, they kept the 10 officers, except that the Druid was replaced by an Anam Cara Eglsha, an Anam Cara of the church. Okay? In Old Irish, we're taught never to believe in Druids. It's one of the sort of lessons you imbibe at birth. And so the Old Irish scholarly tradition, this is my interdisciplinary hat here, would not treat Geoffrey Keating as a good source for pre-Christian Ireland. And what I'm interested in is that if you look at 12th century sources, and particularly sources which deal with, as people are starting to go to universities, there's a whole series of romances which get told, which deal with clerics who, as it were, have taken a different route. They haven't become diocesan, they haven't become monastic, they've started to work for the king as chaplains and financiers and chancellors and so forth. And in the romances, what you get is a big overlap between these guys and sorcerers who look at stars and who get wisdom and an ability to prophesize from other contexts. And this is absolutely, makes perfect sense in the context of, we talk about the coming of the Magi. The Magi are people who follow the star. But magus is a word which in hibernal Latin is often translated as druid. And so you get this overlap of sort of a different approach to the other world. Okay? And in the 12th century, when people start going to universities, they start talking about this different approach to the other world in terms of knowledge that comes from the stars, but also knowledge that comes from mysterious books and knowledge that comes from medicine. And it seems to be reflecting the academic curriculum. And I have an example there of some nice quotes where the concepts of churchman working for king and secular, intelligent person interested in otherworldness, such as Merlin, for example, are used in that particular set. That's a translation of stories about King Arthur. Okay, but when you look at Anam Cara in the annals, you start getting Anam Cara being used of associate with kings around about this time in the 12th century. So these are some of the quotes from 10th and 11th century annals of the Four Masters. Or at the end of the 11th century in the Annals of Ulster, you get Príomh Anam Cara, the best Anam Cara of Ireland, or the best Anam Cara of Ireland and Scotland, or the best Anam Cara of the North. Yeah, so you get, and it seems to be reflecting kingdoms. These guys have a kingdom role. Okay? So, my conclusion then is that when I start looking for my Anam Cara, my real Anam Cara as opposed to John Donoghue's Anam Cara, or my medieval Anam Cara, that might be a better way of putting it, I find Anam Cara used of preachers who teach and who lead congregations. I find an Anam Cara used of monastic elders who act as support for young monks and as sources of inspiration. I find an Anam Cara who's used to decree penitentials and to make decisions as to how, whether penance is sufficiently completed. And that penitential role is done both for lay and for religious. And I find an Anam Cara who's used of royal officials who give advice to kings. And I find an Anam Cara who is involved in lay confession. Okay? And I end up saying, well, what exactly is this Anam Cara guy? And I decided, I don't think it is a role, although we have interpreted it as a role. It is actually simply a term of respect that's used for churchmen in general, or church people, because it's also used to females on occasion. And it's actually a reference to, going back to St. Paul, to the notion of the elder of the Christian community, who is, there's a line in the beginning of the Collectio book on priests, which says, priests should always be white-haired. Because the idea is that they should always be wise and be a bit, have experience. And I think that's what the Anam Cara is really representing. It's somebody who is respected by the community, who is has gone through life experience, as it were, and is providing support for other Christians. But I don't think you can narrow it down to a more specific role than that. that. Because as I say, when you go through all the references, they seem to be playing a whole variety of different roles. And I finish up with Brother Anthony blessing the boats of the Gandelos down outside the Clarion, which I was at last year. And there, again, it seems to me we're talking about a churchman who's respected by the wider lay community, who's a monastic, but not playing in this instance a monastic role. And that degree of confusion, it seems to me, is absolutely what is represented by the Irish Anam Cara. Thank you very much.